This year's 28th Conference of Orientale Lumen is dedicated to a very important subject, the topic of primacy in the 21st century. This topic is extremely important since the major topic which caused the rupture of communion between East and West, between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, was related to the question of the role of the Bishop of Rome, or more precisely, the question of papal primacy. The Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church has been working on this topic for about 20 years now, and has issued three very important documents related to that topic. The first topic was issued in 2007 in Ravenna. This is why it is often referred as the Ravenna document. And it is entitled Ecclesial Communion, Conciliarity, and Authority. The second document, which was issued related to that topic, is the document of Chieti, issued in 2016, so 9 years after Ravenna. And its title is Synodality in Primacy in the First Millennium. And finally, last but not least, last year in Alexandria in 2023, the Commission has issued a very important document entitled Synodality in Primacy in the Second Millennium and Today. It is interesting that the question of primacy was at first addressed in the Ravenna document from the perspective of the authority of the Church. The Ravenna document, in its paragraph 12 and 13, reminds us that in the Church, authority is related to the person of Christ, because Jesus Christ is the head of the Church. Nevertheless, the Church as an institution in the world is not something invisible. Of course, we have Jesus Christ as our invisible head, the head of the mystical body of Christ, which is the Church. But as an institution, we always have as a head a person, a bishop. This is why the Ravenna document is analyzing the question of communion, conciliarity, and authority at three levels. At the local level, the level of the diocese, where we have at the head of the local church a bishop. Conciliarity and authority at the regional level, the level of the ecclesiastical province, or if you want, at the level of the Metropolitanate or the Patriarchate, where once again, at the head of the Synod of Bishops, we have a senior bishop, a Metropolitan or a Patriarch. And finally, at the universal level, the Ravenna document speaks about the taxis, the order between the patriarchs, mentioning especially the order in the ancient church, the 5 ancient patriarchates, the Patriarchate of Rome, of Constantinople, of Alexandria, of Antioch, and Jerusalem. What is very important in this document of Ravenna is that the document underlines that authority and conciliarity, or if we want, in other words, primacy and synodality, go hand by hand. Let me read you paragraph 43 of this very important document. It states, primacy and conciliarity are mutually interdependent. That is why primacy at the different levels of the life of the church, local, regional, and universal, must always be considered in the context of conciliarity, and conciliarity likewise in the context of primacy. What does it mean? It means very, in other words, that in order to have a council, in order to have a synod, which are ecclesial assemblies, we need to have a presiding bishop. We need to have a president. So therefore, a synod, a council, needs primacy. But at the same time, in order to be the president, in order to be the first one, we must have other ones. You cannot be the first one between you and yourself. You need others. In other words, in order to have primacy, you need conciliarity, you need synodality. And paragraph 43 of the document of Ravenna continues stating, concerning primacy at the different levels, we wish to affirm the following points. Primacy at all levels is a practice firmly grounded in the canonical tradition of the Church. Second, while the fact of primacy at the universal level is accepted by both East and West, there are differences of understanding with regard to the manner in which it is to be exercised, and also with regard to its scriptural and theological foundation. So you see, this document of Ravenna is very important because it clearly states that there is a universal primacy, but at the same time, it states that the understanding of the primacy at the universal level is different in East and West. In other words, there is not a problem for the Orthodox to accept the primacy of the Church of Rome, which presides in love, as it has been admirably expressed by Saint Ignatius of Antioch. But the question is to understand how this primacy is being exercised. This is why, at the conclusion of the document, it is said that the way primacy of the Bishop of Rome is being exercised has to be studied in depth. Paragraph 45 says, it remains for the question of the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion of all the churches to be studied in greater depth. What is the specific function of the Bishop of the First See in an ecclesiology of koinonia, of communion, and in view of what we have said on conciliarity and authority in the present text? How should be the teaching of the First and Second Vatican Councils on the universal primacy be understood and lived in the light of the ecclesial practice of the first millennium? These are crucial questions for our dialogue and for our hopes of restoring full communion between us. So, this is the question that has been studied further by the second very important document that we have, the document of Chieti, issued in 2016. And this document is focusing on the question of synodality and primacy during the first millennium. Why during the first millennium? Because the first millennium is the period of history when the churches of East and West were in full communion. And therefore, it has been said on many occasions in ecumenical contexts, but also it has been said by several popes, the last popes that the Roman Catholic Church, which have been at the head of the Roman Catholic Church, that the first millennium is our paradigm, since the first millennium is the period when we were united. And therefore, we have to accept the practice of the first millennium as the standard one, the one on which everybody agrees, since everybody was in full communion during that period. So this is why the document of Chieti makes a very precise analysis of the exercise of primacy during the first millennium. The document of Chieti continues with this distinction of primacy and synodality on three levels. The local level, the level of the diocese, the regional level of the Metropolitanate or Patriarchate, and the universal level, which have been defined in the previous document of Ravenna. Nevertheless, the document of Chieti specifies that the exercise of primacy and synodality is not exactly the same at each level. Because if we take, for example, the regional level, which has been described as for the practice of the regional synods, where there is a first bishop among other bishops, we do not find one bishop among other bishops at the local level, since at the level of the diocese, the bishop is alone. But nevertheless, the bishop at the local level, the level of the diocese, is at the head of his diocese. So he's at the head of many parishes. So it's not exactly the same, but we can find analogies. And in the same way, the document of Chieti is very prudent, saying that at the universal level, it's not exactly the same as at the regional level, but nevertheless, there are analogies that can be applied. It is also significant to note that the Chieti document has chosen the words synodality and primacy instead of the words conciliarity and authority that have been used in the previous document of Ravenna. It's not a huge difference, but we see that, first of all, we start speaking from the document of Chieti of synodality instead of conciliarity. And since the document of Chieti, the notion of synodality has become very much popular in the Roman Catholic Church. And also, this is in the context of this synodality that the document of Chieti places the exercise of primacy. In paragraph 15, the document of Chieti reminds us that the Church at the universal level implies a taxis, an order of the patriarchates. This has been established in the ancient church with the system of the Pentarchy, which has put the See of Rome as the first see, the See of Constantinople coming right after, because Constantinople was the new Rome, the new capital of the empire, and then followed by the See of Alexandria, the See of Antioch, and the See of Jerusalem. It is said that in this context of the Pentarchy of the 5 patriarchs, the first patriarch, the Patriarch of Rome, the Pope of Rome, has a primacy of honor, presvia times. This is clearly stated in paragraph 15. Then in paragraph 16, it mentions that in the West, subsequently, was developed a doctrine, a notion of the Bishop of Rome as being the first patriarch in the Pentarchy, as having a special Petrine ministry. In other words, the role of the Pope at the universal level was somehow linked with the role of the Apostle Peter among the 12 apostles. And paragraph 16 of the document of Chieti notes that this notion of the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome was not adopted in the East. So this is a first, first difference that we have, that in the East, the notion of Petrine ministry was not developed, and this caused subsequently some misunderstandings. Finally, the paragraph 18 of the document of Chieti gives us some criteria settled by the Second Council of Nicaea, also known as the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which was held in 787, as describing not only the criteria for the reception of a council, but also which describes admirably the role of the Bishop of Rome as the Patriarch of the Pentarchy, which presides in law. Let me quote a part of paragraph 18. It says, "The Church's understanding of the criteria for the reception of a council as ecumenical developed over the course of the first millennium. For example, prompted by historical circumstances, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, Nicaea II, 787, gave a detailed description of the criteria as then understood. The agreement, symphonia, of the heads of the churches, the cooperation, synergia, of the Bishop of Rome, and the agreement of the other patriarchs, synphronundes. An ecumenical council must have its own proper number in the sequence of ecumenical councils, and its teaching must accord with that of previous councils. Reception by the Church as a whole has always been the ultimate criterion for the ecumenicity of a council." So it is worth noting in this paragraph 18 of the document of Chieti that while describing the criteria for recognizing a synod, a council, as being ecumenical, we can see the role of the first, the primate of the universal level, the Bishop of Rome, which has to cooperate with the other bishops, and that an agreement, symphonia, must be achieved among the patriarchs. So we can see that the role of the primate, in other words, primacy, is being described in the framework of synodality, of conciliarity. The document states in its conclusion that during the first millennium, East and West were always conscious of belonging to one church. And this is why it recognizes in the practice of the first millennium a source of inspiration and a reference point, a paradigm for both Roman Catholics and Orthodox who are seeking to overcome their division and restore full communion between their churches. Having dealt with the first millennium as the paradigm, the model for today, the work of the Commission since the Plenary of Chieti in 2016 until last year So, in other words, during 7 years, more or less, the Commission was working on the question of synodality and primacy in the second millennium and today. Why spending so much time on the second millennium? Because, first of all, the second millennium is the period of the history where the difficulties have appeared. This is where communion has been suspended between East and West. And also, this is during that period that several teachings have appeared about the universal jurisdiction of the Pope, the infallibility of the Pope, and this was already pointed out at the conclusion of the Ravenna document. So a study, a deep study, was necessary. But at the same time, the purpose of studying together the history, and this is something we have to underline, that this is for the first time that Roman Catholic and Orthodox theologians read history together in order to achieve the same common conclusions. And they did so not only for the purpose of doing only history. History is very important, but we cannot change history. So the goal is not studying the history. The history is important in order to achieve communion today. So this is why the document is entitled Synodality and Primacy in the Second Millennium and Today. So inspiring us to think how the problems, the issues that have divided us in the past can be resolved in the church of today. The document of Alexandria, which for the reasons that we have explained is very much historical. It's a rather historical reading rather than a dogmatic document or systematic document. It starts by acknowledging that the second millennium was the millennium of the troubled history of Christian East and Christian West. It starts noting in the first part, in paragraph 1.4, that the consolidation of the role of the Pope as the head or the chief of the whole ecclesial body, in other words, the head of the universal church, was developed in the West during a period of history which was troubled, when secular powers were attempting to have an authority or to have some kind of authority over the church. So in other words, it was responding to these dangers that in the West, the notion of the Pope being the head of the universal church was being developed. A phenomenon that was not appearing in the East, which was still, at least until the end, more or less the end of the 15th century, a part of the Byzantine Empire. Nevertheless, in paragraph 1.45, the document says very clearly that although the role of the Pope as the head of the universal church was growing, synodality in the West was not abandoned. And it mentions that different forms of synodality did exist. Then the document comes to a later stage of history, the period of the Protestant Reformation. And once again, the Reformation was a phenomenon that appeared only in the West. And because of the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church had to react, had to respond in a unified way. And this is where the papacy, in the context of the Protestant Reformation, took the lead of the reforms that were needed in the church. This is what is being developed in paragraphs 2.1 and 2.2. And of course, because of that, papacy has been criticized by the Protestant reformers. Then a third stage comes with Vatican I, the council that has promulgated the universal jurisdiction of the Pope of Rome and its infallibility. And the document states in paragraph 3.5 that this was actually a response to the situation in which the church was in the West. It was a reaction against a form of conciliarism that in fact rejected the notion of primacy and stipulated that the council has to govern the church, and also different forms of local nationalism that were dividing the church into small national, the tendency that wanted to divide the universal church into different local national churches. So in other words, this was a response in order to assure the unity of the church in the West. Finally, the document comes to the period of the 20th century, which was a period of ressourcement. In other words, a period of returning to the sources. We have seen in the 20th century the renewal of the biblical studies, the renewal of the patristic studies. And thanks to the renewal of the biblical and patristic studies, this had implications on also ecclesiology. This is when, for example, coming from the patristic studies, the notion of Eucharistic ecclesiology has been developed and became a new basis for the rapprochement between the churches in general and between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in particular. And the document speaks a lot about the Council Vatican II, which has presented a balance between made a balance between the teachings of Vatican I and what is being experienced by the churches of the East. And on the basis of this historical survey of the second millennium, the document of Alexandria comes to very important conclusions that are enlightening for us today in the third millennium. First of all, in the paragraph 5.1, it states that the church cannot be properly understood as a pyramid with a primate governing from the top, but neither it can be understood properly as a federation of self-sufficient churches. So, in other words, primacy and synodality have to go hand by hand. Also in paragraph 5.2, the document of Alexandria gives a great attention, a lot of credit to the notion of communion, the notion of koinonia, which is a key notion in the Eucharistic ecclesiology. It states that the Second Vatican Council opened new perspectives by fundamentally interpreting the mystery of the Church as one of communion. Today, there is an increasing effort to promote synodality at all levels in the Roman Catholic Church. And there is also a willingness to distinguish what might be termed the patriarchal ministry of the Pope within the West or Latin Church from his primarial service with regard to the communion of all the churches, offering new opportunities for the future. And finally, in paragraph 5.4, the document underlines that, I quote, the interdependence of synodality and primacy is a fundamental principle in the life of the Church. It is intrinsically related to the service of the unity of the Church at the local, regional, and universal levels. However, principle must be applied in specific historical settings, and the first millennium offers valuable guidance for the application of the principle just mentioned. So, as you see, the three major documents issued at the beginning of the 21st century by the Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church are very promising. We see a rise of interest for synodality in the Roman Catholic Church. We see also discussions in the Orthodox Church about the necessity of a primate in order to assure the communion of local independent autocephalous churches. So we have now a common basis. These documents have to be received not only by the bishops and the heads of the church, but also by the pleroma of the churches, by all the faithful and the clergy. And this gives us hope to come to a mutual understanding, which would enable us in the future to consider reestablishing the full communion between our churches. I wish you all to read this document, to study them, in order to come to a better understanding of this very important topic for Christian unity. Thank you very much for your attention.